This is an exciting week for me. It's the last week of school at the school I work at, and it's the last week before the second meeting of Luca Fitz. It stands for Lorem Fundamentum Nobis Stari. As always, if you're in the South Denver area and would be interested in an old school philosophy discussion, or just know anyone who would be, come our way this Sunday. If you need info, just email me at danteinferno04@yahoo.com. I've got a co-host today. This is Una Maria. She's my daughter, and she'll probably fall asleep in a couple minutes here. This week, I'm just going to give you my general reaction to Book 2 in the Nicomachean Ethics. If you remember this is the extra credit on our homework assignment. Like I said in the past video, Book 2 seems to kind of just be a fleshing out of Book 1. So without further ado, Book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics as interpreted by an inebriated college dropout. In Chapter 1, we have the distinction between simply having virtue and developing it through action. Aristotle makes it sound as if we have the potential virtue already in our nature, and our virtuous actions develop it further. Now, if you remember from last week, I was talking about how I like Aristotle's idea, but only if it applies on an individual basis. My example is that my brother and I would have radically different codes of virtue, if you will, because we are radically different people. I would think that this idea that he gives us right at the start of Chapter 1 fits equally well with both my interpretation of what he said and what it looks like he actually meant. But I'm going to probably talk about this a bit more later on. By using an analogy of the senses, Aristotle attempts to explain how one develops virtue. A lot of modern physiologists would disagree with his example, but I think that's due mostly to semantics. Basically, in his analogy, he describes how the use of basic sense capacities develop into, actual senses. When you're born as a baby, you kind of look around and you start focusing on things, and that develops into the sense of sight. In the case of hearing, it's kind of one of those things where they make fun of it in TV shows like the Rugrats and stuff, where the adults sound like they're saying blue blah 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 blah, and that everything going into their head is just kind of gibberish, and then as they use their senses, they start to kind of evolve into the senses as we know them. I don't want to beat this horse till it's dead, but the difference in people's capacities are apparent very early on, which would lead me to conclude that virtue ethics is applicable solely on a case-by-case basis. At the end of Chapter 1, Aristotle says one ought to always monitor their actions, as actions become the habits which bind our behavior. At 1104a, and somewhere earlier in this book, he basically says that this entire work is only a guideline, not a rule. But then he behaves as if his book is kind of the law on virtue, and therefore happiness and the meaning of life. I think that this is basically a blanket excuse for anybody bringing up an example that doesn't fit. Again, the limit cases like, oh, what if the Nazis come to your door and you've got Jews in your basement? Do you always have to tell the truth or whatever? And he just kind of say, this is a guideline, don't take it as rules, unless there's no examples otherwise, then you're supposed to take it as a rule. He doesn't really bring this up anywhere else in Chapter 2, and he definitely doesn't really go into it in detail anywhere else in the book. And that's kind of where I get my conclusion that it's mostly just a backdoor exit in case he needs it. He just kind of moves on to talking about how virtue is the mean between two extremes. He basically outlines a model in which there are certain abilities we have. For instance, courage over here. I would do this with two hands, but I've got a baby in my lap. But then men can achieve that in excess over here at foolhardiness, or in deficit over here at the cowardice level, and this is kind of another, virtue deficit excess. I'll come back to this picture later, but basically the idea is moderation in all things, which would kind of just be the standard code of virtue for him. At the start of Chapter 3, Aristotle basically says that doing good things isn't good enough, despite what he said in Book 1 about being awesome versus doing awesome. He takes it a step further now. He says one has to enjoy doing the good things, or it isn't virtue. Which ties back to the virtue is happiness, because if you learn to like it, it'll make you happy. He says that this is a matter of the right education, which I think points back to family life again as the key to virtue, not politics. At the end of this chapter, he goes on to say that virtue is concerned with pleasure and pain, and that virtue gives rise to actions which actualize that same virtue. It basically sounds kind of like a cyclical problem, even with his caveat that if it's done correctly, it strengthens virtue, and if done wrong, it destroys it. It's really a simple idea, but then trying to get into the nitty-gritty of it and explaining how it works, I mean, you have to have the virtue first to be able to do the action, which actualizes the virtue and therefore strengthens it, and forms this feedback loop. And that's another place where I thought he brought up his fake it till you make it, but I guess he didn't, so I'll talk about that later. Let's see here. In chapter 4, he says that works of art are good and bad based on certain characteristics that they have. But a virtuous act is virtuous because of the manner in which one did the act. For example, one can spell a word right by accident, or pay a debt because they're told to, or they can spell the words right because they're a good speller, and repay debts because they're a just person. And that's kind of the whole thing for virtue. You can accidentally do something that would appear to be virtuous. I mean, if you're not paying attention on the battlefield, you could accidentally lead a charge that would save the day and turn around the battle and that kind of thing. But that wouldn't be courageous, that would be retarded. However, if you were courageous and you saw the circumstances going on and you go, oh, the courageous thing to do would be to lead this charge, and then it turned around the battle, then you would be virtuous. That kind of makes sense from an Aristotelian perspective, where the doing is what's important, not the being. Basically because the doing is consistent then, as opposed to a random accident. This is explained a little bit further in his next paragraph, where he says, a man is not just by doing just things, but by doing them in a just manner. Studying justice doesn't make one just, but imitating a just man's behavior and method of reason makes one just. This is kind of the foundation of Christian virtue ethics, which is basically trying to copy Jesus. I think it's something that a lot more Christians need to get involved in, just based on the examples that they set. But, you know, everybody needs a little bit of work. That's what this whole book is about. Chapter 5 basically says that no one can be blamed for their passions or feelings, but rather they can be blamed for their behavior. It's not nice for me to hate someone or lust after someone I can't have, but it's not really blamable because passions are just things that happen until I actually act on it. Again, it's not like attributes that you have, but it's what you do that ultimately defines you, according to Aristotle. At the end of chapter 5, he says, again, we have the capacities by nature, but we are not made good or bad by nature. We have spoken of this before. If, then, the virtues are neither passions nor capacities, all that remains is that they should be states of character. With all of the context provided up until this point, it sounds as if he's saying we each have our individual capacities, which, with the proper attention, we would develop into a state of character. This character of being virtuous.